I wonder who was in the crowd that day. Matthew has a habit throughout his gospel of referring to the crowd as if it were one person, one character in the story. And we know that, to a certain extent, crowds can become unified, acting together. But within a crowd, there are still individuals who feel more or less in tune with how the crowd is acting as a whole. The priests and the elders were there, guiding the crowd from within. And I'm sure there were some in the crowd who were in agreement with them. They believed Jesus was a troublemaker and a blasphemer who deserved death. There were others who perhaps didn't have a strong opinion about Jesus, who'd come out of curiosity and were willing to trust the voices of their leaders. If the priests and the elders said it, it must be true, mustn't it? And so they gave their voices to the crowd. But perhaps there were some who had heard Jesus teaching in the temple that week, or previously around Galilee. Maybe they weren't so sure that Jesus should die. Maybe they joined in uncertainly, not wanting to be seen to go against the priests and the elders. Or maybe like Pilate, they went along with the majority whilst not agreeing with them, and so absolving themselves of responsibility for what happened next. I'm sure there were a few followers of Jesus who were crying out against the crowd, their voices being drowned out by those calling for Jesus' death. And of course, we know there were some of Jesus' followers who'd already run and hid in fear. As I hear these words, I hear echoes of the church down the centuries in the voice of the crowd. Those we hear and those we don't. Too often it's been our own priests and elders who have been the ones in the crowd urging on to hate. These very words that we've heard from Matthew's Gospel have been used as a foundation for oppression of Jews by the church down through the centuries, as if these people even had the power to call down such a curse. Of course they didn't, and yet the church has behaved as if that was the case. And where it has been the state and not the church engaging in anti-Semitism, all too often the church has remained silent where it should have called for justice. This complicity in oppression, either joining in or standing by, has sadly been repeated time and time again by the church to so many different groups of people. In Britain, we're only just beginning a conversation about our complicity in the injustice of empire and the enslavement of people, particularly in the transatlantic slave trade. Many civic bodies across the country, including our own council here in Glasgow, are beginning to reflect on their own involvement in the barbaric trade and in empire more broadly. In the church, we have our own journey to walk in this matter. We're quick to talk about William Wilberforce and others who worked to abolish slavery. And yet we're not so quick to talk about the British Church's involvement in slavery and colonialism. Jomo Kenyatta said in a phrase often repeated by Desmond Tutu, "When the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, 'Let us pray,' and we closed our eyes. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land." We have a responsibility in the church to uncover the truth of what our involvement in empire was, to acknowledge the voices of those who preached oppression, as well as those who called for justice. It's not that we now are responsible for the actions of our forebears, But the economic and social inequalities of empire ripple down through the years, and there is much work to do to address the stubborn injustices that we have inherited. The whole church was present in that crowd, I think, all those years ago. On that day, it was the voices of hate and the silence of indifference that held sway. And too often since then, these are the patterns that the church has fallen into. How does Jesus look at the crowd? The crowd of his church down through the centuries, as well as the crowd in front of him on Good Friday. How does Jesus look at us? It's hard to acknowledge that we have probably been all of those voices at different times, often without realizing it. The voices of the priests and elders are not always whipping up violence. Sometimes they are quiet and reasonable as they advocate a way with little concern for how it will hurt others. Those in authority can feel their hands are tied, so it is not their fault that they do not act. Life has enough pressures without the need to question or challenge those in authority. It is easier just to get on with things. And then sometimes something sparks in us, and we do speak up against the gathered voices of the crowd and the weight of the history of the church. And Jesus looks at us all, the crowd, the leaders, the faithful followers, and the silent bystanders. Jesus looks at us all with love. Because the beginning and the end of the gospel is love. It's why Jesus came. It's why Jesus died. It's why Jesus stands beside his Father in heaven, praying for us even now. And that's why we can come, just as we are.